All right, welcome back. This is a lecture over the Articles of Confederation, our first national government. Thankfully, did not last very long. So let's get right into it. And share. All right. Articles of Confederation, 1777. 89. This was our first attempt at a national government, and you should keep in mind that everything in the Articles of Confederation is a reaction to the 1760s and 1770s treatment that the British had given to the colonists. And I'll explain that as we go a little bit in. Before the Articles of Confederation went into effect, the colonies began transforming themselves into states. And so what we have are a number of state constitutions, which a number of traits from the state constitutions will show up in the Articles of Confederation. And so I kind of want to look at that. Let's see, does this work? Yeah. All right, state constitutions, articles, I'm just going to call it the AOC, the Articles of Confederation. All right. So in the state constitutions, they weaken the power of the governors, and at least, I believe, two of the states simply had no governor. And again, the experience in the 1760s and 1770s, the governors of the colonies had always been on the side of the monarch and had a lot of power. And so the idea was to not let governors have a lot of power. At the national level, there was no executive. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no president. There was no executive branch at all. It simply did not exist. Move back over here. This sounds kind of dumb, but written down. As we talked about way back in our video on colonial politics, the British Constitution was not a written document. And so it was decided that these documents that were going to govern the states and the nation would be written documents that everybody could read for themselves. Protection of civil liberties. You'll recall during the run up to the revolution, the suspension of habeas corpus, trying people by military juries when they weren't part of the military, shutting down newspapers, shutting down assemblies, all those type of things. So those type of civil liberties are going to be expressly protected under the state constitutions and then under the Articles of Confederation, because they're very important. The right to free speech and the right to a free press and the right of habeas corpus and all those things are extraordinarily important. There's no judiciary in the Articles of Confederation, so there is no Supreme Court in this system. The power to tax belongs to the states. The power to draft an army belongs to the states. And the power to regulate trade, you guessed it, belongs to the states. And so, again, I should probably actually move these over here as well. Tax, draft army, regulate trade. Okay. So, a very, very bizarre government, which again, all of the power lies within the states and not, again, the national government. It lies within the state government. So, very, very strange sort of hybrid government. So, how exactly did things work between the states and federal government? Well, that was a process called rejudging. Right? So here's how rejudging worked. See if you don't think it's the stupidest thing you've ever heard of. Congress, Articles of Confederation, Congress passes a law. Let's one of the laws Congress passed was like a 1 cent tax on imports to fund the army. Okay. The states could either accept or reject this law. And in this particular instance, the states did actually is a 1 cent tax imports to fund the army is rejected. That's how the relationship worked. Congress could pass a law, but the states were free to reject it or accept it. And most states usually rejected it. In fact, this particular instance I'm talking about here, the 1 cent tax, February of 1781, 12 of the states agreed to collect it. Whoops. Rhode Island did not. And so the other 12 states changed their mind. I don't know how that's supposed to work. I've read about it and studied. It looks as stupid as it sounds. I'm just here to explain it, not to justify it. So, yeah, that is the kind of nonsense we're looking at here. Now, before we put the Articles of Confederation out of its misery, I do want to talk about the two successful things the Articles of Confederation did. One was the Ordinance of 1785, Ordinance. You'll recall that the United States got a lot of territory from the Treaty of Paris. Well, that territory needs to be explored, mapped, surveyed, and sold. So that's what the Ordinance of 1785 did. It provided money for Congress to map those territories and sell the land there to raise money. And again, that money goes to Congress. It is not state money. The second and related is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this was the process by which a territory, the word I have misspelled here, let's try that again, a territory, thank you, becomes a state. We have 13 states because we have 13 colonies. So that's a pretty easy one. But how do we get new states? And there were various ideas sort of kicked around and finally came up with this one. When a territory is created, so the Michigan territory, the Kentucky territory, they get a governor and 3 judges from Congress. When the population reaches 5,000, they can elect a state legislature, pass laws. And that's 5,000 white people. That is not going to count Native Americans or African Americans, free or slave. When the population reaches 60,000, again, white people, they can write a constitution and apply for statehood. So it sets up a very simple process with clear benchmarks about how to become a state. Now, the Northwest Ordinance, there are 2 other things: religious toleration and no slavery. Now, this only applies to the Northwest Ordinance, which, going back to this map, is this area here in the sort of aqua blue. So what are now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I think that's Wisconsin, that's Michigan, the upper and lower peninsula. That's it. There's a separate Southwest ordinance down here that does allow slavery. It does everything the Northwest ordinance, but does allow slavery, right? So that is going to be how we're going to make states. And then that process of 5,000, 60,000 will carry us out across the rest of the country to the Pacific. So that whole step-by-step benchmark will continue on. So those will be the only 2 successful things the Articles of Confederation Congress accomplishes. What begins to happen is things begin to come apart. And so there are a number of what I'm going to call economic problems and a number of what I'm going to call diplomatic problems. And the Articles of Confederation will be unable to deal with any of these as the country begins falling apart. All right, let's start with economic problems. The economy is in what we refer to as the toilet. Okay? Britain will not trade with us because they are sore losers. They have been our natural trading partners for over a century, but now they will not trade with us. We have practically no manufacturing. That's part of the mercantile system, a legacy of the mercantile system. We were not allowed to manufacture. So we have very, very little. I'm going to say no because it's, for all intents and purposes, no manufacturing. So in order to buy stuff, manufactured products, we're spending our gold and silver, which are now running low. Paper money has been tried and is now worthless. And that was at the federal level. Some states tried printing their own money, and even a couple of cities tried printing their own money. And finally, there are soldiers and merchants from the war waiting to be paid. Economic problems. Diplomatic problems. British troops on American soil in the Great Lakes. So there were still British troops up here on our territory and refused to leave, largely because of, remember in the Treaty of Paris, we talked about loyalists have to be compensated and both sides have to cooperate to collect pre-war debt. That's not going so well for the Americans. So the British are refusing to leave because of that. In addition to that, natives from Spanish Florida are attacking Georgia. Okay. There's disagreement about where the border between the United States and Spanish Florida is. Florida thinks it's up here. So about half of what is now Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, Spain is claiming. We're claiming it as well. And much like we saw from Unit 1, the natives, the American Indians from Spanish Florida attacking Georgia, and there's nothing we can do to stop them. And then finally, and this one would really kind of fall under diplomatic and economic if there was a way for me to put like a third box in here. July, you don't need to know the date, keep us on track. Spain closes New Orleans to Americans, specifically the trade. And that has a ripple effect on the economy. I'm going to put it under both. Because New Orleans is vitally important to Americans living out here. Okay. If you live out here, it's easier to transport your goods. Let's say you grow corn or you grow wheat. It's easier to transport it down the rivers, the Ohio and then the the Mississippi, to New Orleans than to try to take it back over the Appalachian Mountains. And so New Orleans is vitally important to the United States economic development. Plus, we want to get people, Americans, living out here as well. And in order to do that, we need to have some place for them to trade. And so the closure of New Orleans is a massive disaster economically for the United States. And in fact, some of the Western people living out West start flirting with the idea of seceding from the United States and joining the Spanish Empire so that they can have access to New Orleans again. So this is a really very, very dangerous move. In order to try to deal with some of this, a meeting was held called the Annapolis Convention, 1786. And it's a meeting of 5 states. You don't need to know them, but they're basically the states right in this area. So Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, probably New York as well. The idea there between these 5 states is to create some trade treaties between them. Because what was beginning to happen is the states were now charging import taxes on each other. So if you lived in Virginia and you had some tobacco that you were going to take to Pennsylvania, you had to pay an import tax. If you had a bunch of potatoes or whatever they grow in Pennsylvania, wheat, and you tried to take it to Virginia or Delaware, you were having to pay import taxes. So the states are beginning to turn on each other. The Annapolis Convention was hopefully a way to try to undo some of that. Very little comes of the actual trade negotiations, but what does come out of the Annapolis Convention is a letter to Congress asking for a formal convention to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, that it was a weak document, that all of its problems could be blamed, all the country's problems could be blamed on the relationship between states and the national government. It should be redone. And again, that's a letter signed by like heavy hitters, like George Washington's signatures on that letter. James Madison's signature, although he's not the heavy hitter, he will become later. But there are a lot of signatures on that letter. Congress reluctantly sets a meeting date. And this is, fortunately, Shays' Rebellion comes along and finally puts an end to the Articles of Confederation. In Massachusetts, a lot of soldiers, Revolutionary War soldiers, had still not been paid. And many of them were also farmers who were in debt and being sent to debtor's prison. They used to put you in prison if your debts, if you couldn't pay them. Okay, so not quite as severe these days. And you know, these are soldiers. These are men who had served their country and still had not been paid. So Daniel Shays, who had served in the army, basically formed a militia, probably about 2,000 men, and went to war, attacking banks, courthouses, sheriffs. You know, if you go to the bank and you destroy the bank's records, if there's no record of the debt, there's no debt. Courthouses where criminal proceedings against debtors might take place, going to sheriff's houses and warning them that they should probably not put any more farmers in jail. Pretty serious revolt. The federal government is unable to do anything here because the federal government, the Articles of Confederation government, cannot draft an army and cannot collect taxes, pay for an army. So an army, a militia of 2,000 men, has completely stymied the powers of a government that represents 2 million people. You can understand why, use whatever metaphor you want, the straw that broke the camel's back, the final nail in the coffin, Daniel Shays is it. And the Articles of Confederation is finally seen as the piece of crap that it is. There should be statues of Daniel Shays all over this country. Unfortunately, there are not. So it is a wake-up call. It is a fire alarm, okay, whatever you want to call it, that the federal government needs reform. Now, one person had been thinking about reform for quite a long time, and that is James Madison. James Madison is our government's first, I believe today they call them wonks. You may call them nerds. But he had been thinking about the failures of the Articles of Confederation for about 5 years. And he'd done a thorough study on every form of government that had ever existed that he could get his hands on records. So monarchies, the nation states of the early Renaissance, all types of stuff. And he had been working overtime to try to come up with solutions. Madison, what is called Madison's Vices is what the document is known as today, but he published a document before the Constitutional Convention talking about the problems in government. Okay. So let's look at these vices. One, states deserve much of the blame because they will not cooperate with each other or Congress. Remember, we talked back here about this 1 cent tax. Okay. States didn't cooperate with each other, didn't cooperate with Congress. They deserve a lot of the blame for the situation that we are currently in at 1786. Two, prejudging is a joke. Those aren't his exact words, but we're getting close. Okay. Asking doesn't work. Okay. Laws have to be binding on states and individuals. You can't ask people to follow the law. It has to be something that binds them. Then third, there's no executive or judiciary. The fact is, we need an executive or a judiciary to, to lead the country, and in terms of the judiciary, to figure out when the states are arguing with each other, which state is correct. So he recommended a few changes. Now, he's not going to get all these changes in the Constitution, but here's what he recommends. First, let's start with the easy one. We need an executive and a judiciary. Second, the legislature, Congress, needs to be bicameral. At this point, we had a unicameral Congress. We only have one part of Congress. So what we need is a Senate removed from, and I quote, the erratic fever of popular opinion. Meaning that we needed at least one part of Congress that does not answer to public opinion. Okay? Public opinion is shifting. Public opinion is slippery. Public opinion is slippery. Sorry, I said that. It slides around. I mean, let me give you an example. Back at the end of World War I, there were some riots and disturbances, and there were some people who felt, again, popular opinion, that the First Amendment should be removed from the Constitution. The hell, man. Okay. That's what I mean by the erratic fever of popular opinion. And so the Senate, sort of a ultra exclusive part of Congress, needs to be removed so that they are not influenced by all the dum-dums, you and me, in the general population. Third, Congress needs the ability to veto state laws. Okay? Again, Madison puts a lot of the blame on the states. And so he felt that Congress needed to be able to veto state laws because states have a tendency to operate within a narrow range of interests. Okay. And so Congress needs to be able to, Congress, which is supposed to see like the whole picture, the whole nation, needs to be able to cut down on states' independence in action. So very, very radical idea. And to conclude, Madison talks about why the national government had fared so badly since the end of the Revolution. Okay? During the Revolution, the states had put aside their own interests because of the crisis of war. The war had been a crisis. It had been 5, depending on where you start counting, anywhere from 6 to 8 years of this crisis of having to fight the largest empire in the world, and battles and the money problems, and a lot of other stuff we didn't even get to. And that crisis had brought the states together, but with no crisis, states had drifted apart. Okay? And so the solution is not to have another crisis, because you can't operate like that under continual crisis. It's not healthy. I mean, you probably can, but again, it is not healthy. So the solution, federal laws binding on the individuals, on the citizens, on us. That's a better word. That is the solution. Bind Americans together. So that is his solution. And as we'll see in the next lecture, James Madison is going to show up at the Constitutional Convention ready to rock and roll. He has got his plans, he has got his ideas. That nerd has done his homework. And I will see you in the lecture on the Constitutional Convention. Good day.